Welcome to Biblical Demand, and today our guest is Dr. Sai Garth, who is a scientist who held leadership positions at the National Institutes of Health, and he has been a professor of the at the three major universities. He has published over 200 peer-reviewed scientific papers and 5 books, as well as in articles on science and Christian faiths and perspectives in science and Christian faith, more to life and Christianity today. He also serves as the editor-in-chief of the quarterly magazine God and Nature. Moreover, he is the author of the award-winning book, The Works of His Hand, A Scientist's Journey from Atheism to Faith. It's a joy to have you, Dr. Garth.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
So let's begin with your story. Tell us about yourself, that how did you come to know Jesus?
Okay, so I'll try to make it shorter than my book, which is really where the whole story is put out there. I think the most dramatic part of my story is I was not born into a Christian home, and I share that with you and many other people. But my home was actually, the philosophy of my parents was quite anti-Christian. It wasn't just, they weren't just atheists. They believed that God was impossible, couldn't exist. They were Marxists. They were members of the American Communist Party back in the 30s. And I grew up with a very materialist, very anti-spiritual worldview, which admitted to no God, no religion of any kind. And that was my worldview as a child and growing up, even as a young adult. But I was starting to doubt much of that dogma, and it was dogmatic, both the militant atheism part and also the communist part. And I began doubting that partially as a result of what I was studying in college, which was science. I started as a chemistry major, and then I went to graduate school in biochemistry. But while a chemistry major, I was also learning about quantum physics and things like the Schrodinger equation and the uncertainty principle and various other things about modern physics, which I felt just was not consistent with the materialist worldview. I mean, the whole idea that, an electron isn't really there until you observe it, and then it collapses to a wave function. I mean, all of that is real and true, and it's now part of science and materialist, or I should say naturalist science. But it was certainly revolutionary in terms of the idea of the clockwork universe that, people used to believe in. Everything is easily reducible to machines and to processes that are reductionist and materialistic. So I kind of got a little shaky about the whole idea of strict atheism. I began wondering if maybe there really is something else. I didn't know what it might be. I started looking into various religions, including some Indian religions. I looked into yoga. I looked a little bit into Buddhism. I ran away from that because I didn't understand it at all. And I was looking at a lot of things and not really. I think this was a phase where I was an agnostic. I thought maybe God exists, but I don't know. I don't see any evidence for it. And the thing that happened to me was that totally undeserving. I mean, I have done nothing. I did nothing in my life to deserve this, but for whatever reason, the Holy Spirit took mercy on me and actually began communicating with me while I was still a militant atheist in my teens. And I simply ignored these things, and the details are in the book. But eventually I had a couple of dreams that were just so striking that I couldn't ignore them. And I began really thinking about, they featured a figure who really seemed to me like it was Jesus Christ in the dreams. And so I started thinking, well, I never believed in Christianity. I'd been told Christianity was a terrible, oppressive, evil religion, all about going to hell and fire and brimstone and guilt and sin, that. But I also had met a Christian who invited me to go to a church. Now, I was in my late 40s by this time. I had never set foot in a church in my life, any religious establishment of any kind. And I was very nervous. It was a Catholic church. I was terrified. I thought I would be, reviled and cast out and, held up in shame. I walked in and I was amazed because all I heard about was love. I mean, that was the theme of the sermon. It was evident in people shaking my hand and wishing me, the peace of Christ. And it was nice. I was, nobody yelled at me. And I went back a few times. I was not a believer, but there was something about it that completely dissolved the previous barriers that I had to even consider Christianity. And at the same time, I kind of started looking at the Gospels, and when I read Matthew, I was really struck. And I have to say that even today, when I hear anything like the Sermon on the Mount, I get very emotional. And I also read the book of Acts, and that was truly a revelation to me, because when I read that, I said, this is history. Nobody made this up. This is written like history. And I should mention that even though I'm a scientist, I love history, and I've always been a fan of reading history, even though I never became a professional historian. But at one point I wanted to. And so I have a feel for history, and the book of Acts was historical. There's no question about it in my mind. Luke was reporting what happened. Maybe there was some exaggeration, maybe a few inconsistencies, but it sounded good to me. And so I began thinking about Christianity. I started going to church more often. And then I had an experience of the Holy Spirit. I guess years had gone by and God was getting a little impatient with me. I still had not made the commitment. And I had an experience which is detailed in the book. I will just say now that it involved me driving on a highway and listening to a preacher on the radio and thinking to myself, well, I like to talk. I wonder how it would be if, I preached, if I gave a sermon, what would I say? And I was thinking about all the things I had discovered about, biochemistry and the incredible beauty of how life works and things like that. But I pulled over the car, which was a lucky thing, turned out, and I started thinking a sermon in my mind. And it didn't come from me. I was a listener as well as the speaker. And it was it was all about love. And it was all about, just as I had experienced at the church, and it was all about Christ's love for me, which I had never thought about. And it was extremely powerful. When it was over, lasted maybe 10 minutes at the most, maybe less, I started crying, and I knew I was a Christian. I knew that was it. I was following Christ from then on, and the rest, just fell into place. But since that moment, I've never had any doubt. And I've often described the immense, indescribable feeling of when I said out loud, sitting in that car on the side of the road, I believe. And this may have happened to you as well. I know it's happened to many people. I felt this amazing joy, light, relief. A burden fell away, and that's it. I mean, it's never changed. So, yeah, that's how I came to faith.
Wow, that's so wonderful to hear that you were an hardcore atheist and your doubt led you to seek the truth, and God
Right.
used your friend who introduced you to the church and
Right.
to the gospels, and after that Holy Spirit led you and convicted you to the truth. That was really amazing to hear that. And also I know that you have very vividly have experienced atheism also, because you know your mindset was like atheist, but
Yeah.
now you're a theist. So we usually ask, or I would say we demand the evidence for the existence of God. And vividly, there is numerous evidences for the existence of God. But I want to ask you, on the other hand, is there any evidence for atheism?
Great question. I think last week I tweeted something about that. I said that when I was an atheist, I thought there was no evidence for God, but then I understood that there was no evidence at all for atheism. I got a lot of pushback on that one. But see, the problem with the reason that I say there's no evidence for atheism is that it is not true that atheism is simply a disbelief in any gods, which you will always hear over and over again from the leading atheists and many of their followers. That's not true. When you're an atheist, the way I was, or I think the way many current atheists are, is you don't only not believe in God, there's a whole bunch of other things you don't believe, and a bunch of things you do believe. So now, there's no rule that says that. There's no dogma. It's just that people tend to follow leaders. And the leaders of the new atheist movement have been pushing these ideas, such as there's no such thing as free will, Sam Harris. The universe, as Richard Dawkins said, at bottom is nothing but pitiless indifference. So there's no spirituality, there's nothing like that. Everything is explainable by evolution. And I don't believe that that's true. In fact, it's scientifically not true. You will find atheists who will explain everything from, modern human behavior to, I don't know, anything you can think of as a result of evolution. And that's not what the theory of evolution is about. So that's scientifically false. You have to believe when you're that kind of an atheist that not only are there no gods, but there is nothing else other than pure materialism. And that's difficult because, my father, who was a scientist, told me that science doesn't answer everything. He knew that, and he hated the idea of God. But he knew that there are things like art, music, creativity, love, poetry, which have nothing to do with science. Science cannot evaluate Shakespeare. Science doesn't tell us why, a Kandinsky is beautiful. I mean, it can't. It's not a scientific issue. It's not supposed to be. However, the modern atheists are very strong believers in scientism. And scientism, as I think you and your listeners know, is a bankrupt philosophy, which has been disproven philosophically many times, is that the only answers to any question are found in science. And that's just completely unscientific. And most scientists don't believe that. It's mistaken. So all of these mistaken beliefs, which so many atheists hold, and I know there are exceptions and some don't, but all of those beliefs to me are evidence against atheism. So, and it's definitely true that I rejected atheism as a worldview long before I embraced God and Jesus Christ. I didn't know what else there was. I mean, that's why I kept looking. I even went into New Age and transcendental meditation, lots of stuff that people are doing in those days. But none of that worked for me. And but I was on a search because I knew atheism wasn't real.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's really nice to hear that. As you mentioned that uh, atheists believe that there is nothing beyond this material world, right? There is no soul, no
That's
God.
right.
Yeah. So yeah, as also you mentioned about your father, that he was a scientist, but he was believed in something that is maybe out of this. He believed in the immaterial world, right?
Well, he believed, for example, that you couldn't explain everything by science. So
Yeah.
he was a musician. He played music as a hobby. And you know, he knew there was no science behind why music is beautiful. That's not,
Yeah.
you know, some of the reasons, some of the things people come up with are completely irrational. You know, that we I don't know, we do things because 200,000 years ago, while humans were evolving in whatever, it was advantageous to do this or to do that. And that's just made up stories. It's called evolutionary psychology, and it's not a real science. It's fake.
Yeah.
I mean, it's made up.
That is not
And
supported by evidences, right?
yeah, there's no evidence for any of it.
Yeah.
And you don't actually have to know what the answer is. I mean, that was my father's case. Scientists know that there's always going to be a lot we don't know, but you know, atheists come up with stuff. They distort actual science nowadays to fit their philosophy. And
Yeah.
one of the things that I've been going crazy with is arguing with a bunch of atheists about the genetic code. What some of them have come up with is this crazy idea that the genetic code is not a real code, that it's a metaphor for a code. I mean, where does this come from? I don't know. I mean, there is not one biochemist, atheist or Christian or anybody else who would agree with that. I mean, obviously the genetic code is a real code. It's the first real code. But they're arguing against that idea because the science goes against their philosophy.
Correct.
And I mean, they argue against the reality of fine tuning of the physical constants. And that's strong evidence for a God. And because they don't have a good answer to it, they deny that it's real. Well, this is like, to me, this is no different than, you know, uh, certain Christians who deny other scientific evidence, like evidence for evolution or evidence for global warming or whatever. It's denial of science. And it's always a mistake to use your political or religious or other views to attack science, because you can't win. I mean, you know, once a scientific fact is established and the theory is established, you gotta use some pretty good science to attack it. You can't just say we don't believe in the facts. Okay, well, that's what they're doing. This is what atheists are doing now. They're saying we don't believe in the scientific facts. Whoa. So I tweeted, this got me into even more trouble. I tweeted that, you know, science I'm sorry, atheism is in danger of becoming the worldview that's anti-science. They didn't like that either. But I'm serious about it. I mean, as we learn more and more about the scientific reality of our world, God is looking more and more real. And the only way around that, this is very disturbing for atheists, and the only way around that is to simply deny that these scientific facts from physics and biology are real. And that's what they're trying to do. I think they're digging their own grave.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, that's correct. As you said that they're trying to, I mean, they believe in science, but on the other hand, they're also disapproving science, right?
That's right.
Yeah, as your father also said that science cannot explain everything. So this question is about this, that we see ongoing debates and arguments between theist and atheist about science, that it can or cannot explain everything. So in your opinion, can science explain everything?
No, and as I said, nobody in the sciences thinks that it can. You know, at the same time, you often get demands for evidence. If you believe in God, show us the evidence. Well, yeah, there's plenty of evidence. The story I told you about myself is evidence. All the stories of people coming to faith miraculously and all the miracles is evidence. Well, if you want to deny all of that because it's not scientific, okay, but that's a circular argument. because you're defining science as only the natural world. So how do you can't approach it. But there are also some naturalistic, excuse me, there are some naturalistic evidence for the existence of something that we don't know, and we could call it God. And that includes the fine tuning of the constants. It includes the spontaneous origin of symbolic information, which is in the genetic code. It includes the origin of life, which I believe, and this is a matter of scientific judgment, that cannot be explained. The origin of life cannot be explained by naturalistic concepts alone. And it has not been, and it will not be, despite, decades of intensive research. So how did the origin of life come to be? Well, I don't know, but I'm pretty sure that when we find out, it'll point to God, just as so many other things do. And then, of course, the origin of the universe. I mean, where did that come from? Where did the universe come from? Who clicked the switch for the Big Bang? How did that happen?
Yeah.
From nothing.
Or we can say that science is the another way to worship God. Yeah.
I agree. The quote from my book, which a lot of people have liked and used, is "Science is distilled doxology."
Yeah, still doxology. Correct.
It's
correct.
it's the purest form of praise when you do science, and that's what the original scientists thought. They were Christians who were looking to see how does the world work? Did God make it orderly? Did he come up with fixed laws, which are always obeyed? Yeah, he did. And they found out what the laws were. And that's part of creation. That's part of studying the science of creation.
Yeah, that's correct. That's correct. And also there are some confusions among Christians also about the evolution, right? There is always ongoing debate between young earth creationists and old earth creationists. Some support evolution, some don't support evolution. So as a Christian scientist, and I know you must have done many research on this, that what do you think, is evolution anti-biblical?
Oh, well, I don't think it's anti-biblical. I think it's abiblical. There's no specific discussion of evolution that I know of in the Bible. But I don't think there's anything about evolution that contradicts the Bible. Genesis tells us that God created life and humans, from the dust of the earth. And I see that as a poetic version of talking about the fact that life came from, originally came from chemicals and, regular matter. And the Bible doesn't say how God created, but it's very interesting that unlike several other ideas of origins, and you probably know much more about this than I do, the creation of life in Genesis occurs stepwise. It doesn't all happen at once. And the steps, are, if I'm not mistaken, fish followed by birds, followed by animals on land, and eventually humans. And that's kind of right, and so you have to wonder how people in that age knew that. Why would you think that humans came last? I know there are some creation myths where humans come first and then they create the animals or whatever. So I don't think that evolution is anti-biblical. I actually think that evolution is, and this gets a little complicated, we probably won't be able to get into it, but evolution is actually one of the scientific pieces of evidence for God. And that's because the evolutionary process is not as simple as many atheists would have you believe. It's not simply mutation followed by natural selection. There's something else that has to happen before you can even think about having evolution, and that is you have to have living cells that self-replicate themselves. In other words, they make copies of themselves. That's required for evolution to work. Now, think about that. What else can make a copy of itself? Nothing.
Correct.
Think about a house. Let's say you want to make an exact copy of a house. You could do it, but it would be difficult. But can you imagine a house that made an exact copy of itself? How would it do that?
No, absolutely not.
You'd have to have a house that had all this machinery inside that made, furniture and walls. And that's a lot of machines. You need a pretty big house. Well, that's what cells do all the time. Every cell makes a copy of itself every 20 minutes in some, in many cases. Very fast. How does that happen? That's miraculous. And by the way, that process can't evolve because you need that process to get evolution started. So you can't evolve a very accurate self-replication process because you don't have evolution yet.
Yeah.
So when you look at it in that way, evolution and the origin of life together form a very strong argument for a creator that had to come in and somehow get this process started.
That's pretty interesting to hear this, your insight that we can't say the evolution is anti-biblical, but it is a-biblical because it involves the process and the self-replication. And yeah. So thank you so much for putting light on this. And I think we can discuss more about it and think more about that. Those who do not believe that evolution is biblical, I think there must be sort of the, I would say it is a case of interpretation. How do you interpret the word?
Yeah, exactly.
Right. You see the evolution in that, and some people don't see the evolution in that. Right.
But, yeah. Well, and I'm not saying that evolution is in Genesis. That would be too far.
Yeah, correct.
But what I am saying is that I agree with you that, first of all, let's drop the idea that the Bible has to be interpreted literally because nobody does that. Nobody. I've had debates with young Earth creationists, Kent Hovind and others, and there are some things that they don't interpret literally at all, such as the age of the Earth. It's never mentioned in the Bible. There's no mention of the age of the Earth. It's an interpretation of, the genealogies and the time course of that. But that's an interpretation. That's not the Bible does not say the Earth is 6,137 years old, whatever the number is. It doesn't say that. It leaves that open. And there are so many other things that have to be interpreted in Genesis and in other parts of the Bible. You have to make interpretations. Well, this is what they really meant, or it makes no sense at all. So literal is out off the table. There's no literal interpretation of the Bible that anyone holds to. Now that doesn't mean you can say anything you want. I don't agree with that. I think that, certainly when you're talking about the New Testament, that's literal. It is what it says. It says what happened. That's all. But when you're going back, 3,000 years to a time when we don't even know what people were thinking, it's, the whole cultural context has to be taken into account because this was written by men. God did not take a pen and write this down. So somehow or other, it went through the minds of people.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you on that. That it is Bible. We cannot interpret Bible literally, right? Especially the initial books of the Hebrews. We have to think it through. We have to spend time reading it, and I also believe I was having my guest was Dr. Hugh Ross, who was an astrophysicist.
Oh yeah,
yeah. So we were discussing also this point that the debate should not be on the dates, how old the Earth is, but it should be who created the Earth.
Exactly.
Right. So we should not spend time. I mean, that is important. Also, dates are important, but because then there would be always, there will be two opinions, two interpretations,
That's right.
right? So moving on to this question, that we Christians believe in miracles, right? We thoroughly believe in miracles. We believe that Jesus resurrected from the dead, and we believe Jesus was born of Virgin Mary. So as a scientist, what does science say regarding the birth of Jesus by a virgin?
Well, when it comes to, I mean, I believe that. Of course, I believe all the tenets of Christianity very strongly. And so people say, well, how can you do that as a scientist? Because you know that virgin birth is impossible, resurrection is impossible, turning water into wine is everything's impossible, right? And my answer is, yeah, it's impossible for me and you. But who made the laws of physics? Who made the laws of chemistry? God.
True.
So is it, if God made the law that, the ideal gas law, or the law of mass action, or any of the laws that we use in chemistry or physics, why can't he violate that? Why can't he do something that doesn't fit the laws? It's his creation. Okay. I mean, if you make a bookcase, right, and you decide you want to change the shelf and move it up, you can do it. It's your bookcase. You made it. You know how to do it. So this whole thing of miracles are impossible is insane, because it's ignoring the definition of a miracle. A miracle is impossible, yes, because it's impossible by the laws of nature. But God made the laws of nature, so God can make a miracle. I can't, unless I do what the apostles did, which was they get it from God. But I don't make miracles. They did not make miracles. They prayed for a miracle, and God granted it to them. And so, to me, that's not even an argument. It's just to me, it's a misunderstanding of what a miracle is.
Correct. I mean, absolutely. That you said very right, that God who made the laws of nature. So when He does it, we call it a miracle, right? We can't do it as a human. It is impossible for us,
Right.
right?
That's right.
So
The laws of physics apply to us, but not to Him.
to Him, because He's the one who created, right? Absolutely.
Exactly.
Yeah. So you have written this book, The Works of His Hands. So I want to know what is inside your book. I mean, can you just tell us in a nutshell what is the book is all
Sure.
about?
Let's see.
Yeah. Also, you can show us the copy of that book.
Yeah, here it is. And it's not very long. It's it's not huge. And I'm just going to look through the table of contents because I remember. So the first part is called Getting There. And that's how I got from where I started in the journey to where I ended up. And it's the importance of questions. So that talks about how, as a scientist, I always ask questions, and everyone should. Next chapter is The Irrational World of Modern Physics. And that's where I talk about how some of these questions about the physical nature of the universe made me think, what? What's going on? Then Science Surprises, and I talk about a number of things in science that most people don't know about, but that point to something a little strange. And that includes things like fractals or chaos theory, things like that. The next chapter is Wonderful Life, which is about biology. And then I have a chapter on evolution, explaining what it is and what it isn't. I don't do a lot of arguing for evolution. I don't think that's a very important issue. It's kind of like what Hugh was telling you about what the real argument should be, not how old is the Earth, but how is it made. And with evolution, it doesn't really matter whether evolution is true or not true, because even if evolution is true, it has no arguments against God.
Correct.
The next chapter is called People, and that's about the origin of humans and what humans are like and why I think humans are incredibly special. Oh, that's another thing that atheists have to believe, or seem like they have to believe. They have to accept the idea that human beings are just slightly different than any other animal, not special in any way. That's insane. It's simply insane. And what I like to say is, please send me the link for when the first chimpanzee does an online video with a bunch of chimpanzees and they're arguing about anything. I would love to watch that show. Okay, because chimp argumentation is interesting. Anyway, you get the point. The next chapter is called Origins, where I talk about the three great origins, which is the universe, life, and human consciousness. None of which are explained by anything other than God. I mean, there are no explanations for any of those three origins. The next chapter is the limits of science, and that's the image I use is something that happened to me once. I was driving down a very rustic highway in the countryside, and the paving had stopped, and now it was a dirt road. And eventually, I got to a point where there was a sign that said "Stop." No vehicles allowed past this point, and there was nowhere you couldn't drive. You had to walk along the path. And what I use that image is that's where we are or are getting to in science. There's a point at which we can't use science to get further knowledge, even about the natural world, but certainly about other things other than the natural world. We have to get out of the car and either walk or find some way else to get forward. And that's where faith comes in. The next chapter, chapter 9, is called The Call of Faith, and that's where I describe in detail the experiences I had that led me to confess the truth of Jesus. And then part 2 is issues and questions, and the first one's called But What About? So this is, I had decided I was a Christian, and now all these issues came, like, what about the Bible? What about, science? What about miracles? All the things that that we've been talking about. And I answer those. And then I have chapters on love and freedom, chance and will, evolution and Christianity, the nexus between the two, science and faith together, and a short ending. So the book is a combination of my personal story, my personal journey, as well as quite a bit about the scientific background for how I came to faith. There is some science in it, but most of the comments that I've seen say that it's very accessible. It's written in a style that is sometimes amusing. I have some fairly funny parables, which I thought the publisher would take out, but they allowed them in. I'm originally from New York, so I have a sort of a New Yorker sense of humor, which is a little rough sometimes, but it didn't ruffle too many feathers. And so the tone is a mixture of, some science and personal history and et cetera. So that's the book.
Wow, that looks like a must-read book. Those who want to read this book, you can find the link in the description, and you can order it. It's available on Amazon.in. And I would request, and I would recommend everyone to read this book. I mean, I really like the content, and I would myself read it. So,
Great.
Yeah. So moving on to the last question, which I usually ask to every guest, that what advice would you give to the young Christians, those who are new into faith, or those who are youngsters like me, in this internet age where the information knowledge is vast, right? And they may get influenced by other worldviews and philosophies as well. So what advice you want to give?
Well, to tell you the truth, I find my own mission, and the reason I wrote the book and keep working in various other ways, is not to try to convince atheists or people of other religions to come to Christ. I don't think I can do that. I think that's a job for other people you've interviewed, people like Mike Licona, Hugh Ross, people who are really good at apologetics and know the arguments and can present them. both philosophical and scientific. My goal or my target audience are Christians, young Christians in particular, for example, students who have been fooled by the cultural myth that science and Christianity are two opposing enemies. That is not true. That you have to understand that is not true. Now, you may want to leave the church because you don't like the pastor, because your parents are bugging you. Well, okay. But don't leave the church because you think Christianity is not scientific. And don't leave the church because you have a science teacher who tells you that your faith is nonsense and it's only science that counts. Those are lies. I sometimes call them lies from Satan, because that is what Satan is, a liar, first and foremost. He's the liar. And one of his lies, which is very prominent today in the world, all over the world, is this idea that there is a war between science and faith. That is not true. And the number of Christians who are scientists is large. There are organizations of us. There are famous people. The head of the American and the National Institute of Health, Francis Collins, is a Christian, evangelical Christian. There's, I don't know how many, there are dozens of Nobel Prize winners who are Christians, and many others who are Hindu or Jewish or Muslim, other religions. So the idea that, science is against God is just complete nonsense, and can be proven so. Don't listen to those voices, is my advice. They're very loud and very penetrating. Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and many others around the world, in England and in the US especially, are very strident. I mean, they're influencing the culture. And the problem is that, especially if you're a young Christian in an academia, in India or in England or Europe or the US, you're going to find a very secular environment, unless you're at a Christian school. But otherwise, it'll be very secular and very anti-religious. You have to understand this has not always been true, and it's not going to be true in the future. So what's my advice? Keep the faith. Hold on. Don't be swayed by the devil. Don't be persuaded by false arguments that, what you believe is not real. And hold the faith. Just, keep strong.
Yeah, and truly that's a valuable advice, that do not be influenced by the culture, those who are spreading uh, false teachings like science is against religions, and
Right.
so but keep holding your faith, as you said from your experience, that people like Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, this is just the manipulation of the truth. uh, so just keep hold to the truth and seek truth and keep
That's right.
believing in God. So thank you so much, Dr. Sai, for giving your valuable time. I thoroughly enjoyed it. It was a really insightful conversation with you. I know these questions demand more time, but you tried to give your best answer to the point as short as you can. So really thankful to you for being on my Biblical Demand podcast.
You're welcome, and thank you for having me. It's really great to talk about the Lord.
Okay.